I'm Ankita,
Hello, I'm Tyler.
and today at Web Vibes Only, we are gonna discuss the new Angular style guide, and all the recent changes that have been made into it, and what are our thoughts on it. So let's take a look. The first thing that we want to talk about today are the updates in naming conventions. What do you think about those, Skylar?
I kind of at first I didn't think that I was going to like it, but since I've thought a lot more about it, and I think that it's going to force us to become more intentional with our naming. And I kind of like that. It's something that is different from the rest of the industry. The rest of the industry doesn't name files like this, doesn't have suffixes on their file names and stuff like that. And so like that, I think that just it just adds to the barrier of entry going into Angular from other technologies. And I don't see any real benefit over what people in other frameworks are doing. And, like it does seem nice that we can see, all right, this is a component, and this is these other things like a pipe or whatever. But like I would argue that you could still name that, just don't have the dot suffix.
Yeah,
Um, and then like there's that like I'm not sure that it ever really denoted everything either because I've seen dot service files in Angular be everything from a state store to data store, uh, fetching data, data service to even utility functions. So like, what exactly is that service doing? It could be a lot of things in Angular. So I think this naming chain is ultimately good. It'll take some getting used to, but I think it's ultimately good because I think that I think that it cuts down on the amount that Angular deviates from what has kind of become the industry standard way of doing things. And I don't think that's Angular losing its identity. All the things that make Angular uniquely awesome, like dependency injection and like the Angular router and all that kind of stuff, are still in place. But I think it makes sense to kind of learn and go along with the industry standard for the things that that don't make Angular Angular. And I don't think the file suffix, not file name suffixes, were an identifying characteristic of the Angular framework.
I agree. When they had the RFC for the style guide updates, I think there was a lot of debate around what the extension should be. I know at some point they were considering having the .ng extension, which they dropped. But I think this naming is one of the hardest problems in software engineering. So this will definitely make us more intentional with the names and the purpose of a component. Um, so that it's the purpose is specified in the name versus relying on the fact that it's a component or a service or a pipe. So it definitely will make it more clearer and it will help us navigate to massive just code bases that if you see a card component versus a user card component, it kind of gives you a better picture of what that component might be. So that's a step up from what we originally had, which again, the old style guide hadn't been updated since Angular version 1, if I'm not mistaken. And it was more aligned with just general coding practices and not Angular specific coding practices. So I think this definitely provides more clarity to Angular developers around how to organize their code structure and also how to name things in a better way. I think everyone was doing that using the same file name for components, TypeScript, template, and styles. I don't think I've ever seen someone not do that, but it's nice that it is called out here and using like the same file name for and adding .spec for the test files. So that is a helpful differentiation for when it's actually a test file versus a component. But for the other things, yeah, we didn't really ever need the suffix .component.ts, and I'm happy that we dropped it for sure.
Yeah, I think it will take some getting used to because as people who have worked primarily in Angular for years, at least on the front end, we we tend to look and rely on that dot component to figure out where the component file is and that sort of stuff. But like we'll still in a component folder, we'll still have the TS file. We know that's where our component class is.
Yeah,
Uh, and anything in that folder, like a service that might be co-located with that component, should be named differently. Like you shouldn't need the dot component to differentiate between those.
right.
So, but as Angular developers, we have been conditioned over a period of years to look for those suffixes, and I think there's going to be a period of time where that feels a little bit weird. And now we're going to be like, we haven't worked outside of that. If you haven't used another framework regularly, you haven't worked kind of outside that paradigm. So it's going to be like there's going to be like a little bit of retraining your mind to say, okay, how if we're not doing these suffixes anymore, then
Yeah.
how it's going to change the way you name your things.
Right. Yeah, and I mean it helps the generators have been updated automatically in version 20 that they don't add the suffix, which kind of when you see the generated file and it doesn't resonate with what the purpose of that file is going to be, you are going to rethink the name and just make it easier for your future self and your team members to name it more intentionally. So that one gets a big thumbs up from both of us. I think that was a really great change and a welcome and needed change. In the style guide. All right, I think we can move on to the next thing, the inject function. Yeah, this one about dependency injection. Prefer the inject function over constructor parameter injection. Historically, we would have had to add the inject decorator over whatever we want to be able to inject and add that inside a constructor. Now we just have this handy dandy inject function. Well, it looks like they don't have an example here, but they have this generator that we can run the schematic that converts the constructor based injection in your classes to use the inject function instead, which is super helpful. So if you were using this earlier, this style to inject something, afterwards, as you can see, it just uses the simple inject function. And I think it's, again, like you were mentioning earlier, Kyler, for someone coming from some other framework, all these decorators can feel a bit overwhelming, but a function, who doesn't know and love a function, right?
Yeah, I agree with that take. This is another one that is controversial, and I didn't know how I felt about it at first, um, either, because I come from a years of building with .NET, C Sharp, so the presence of a constructor felt natural to me. Um, like a component is, it's an object. We think of it as an object, or at least I guess not everybody thinks in terms of object, but object-oriented programming has always registered with me pretty well because I think people think categorically, or at least a lot of people think categorically, and I think that's why object-oriented programming became so popular because the concept of an object and properties just I think it inherently makes sense to the way we think. And then so when we're building an object, we have this constructor. Well, if you were to build that object in your mind, what do you need to build that? The constructor provides that.
Yeah.
So I think that kind of pattern always made sense to me. And coming from C Sharp and .NET, Angular 2 kind of made sense in that regard to me. But over a period of years, what I started to realize is that it doesn't always make sense it doesn't really make sense as much in terms of a component because a component isn't just creating an object and then you move that object around, you do things with it, like you call things on it. It's you have the framework that reaches into your component and executes methods, like Angular's lifecycle methods, like ng on init and that sort of thing. The Angular framework itself constructs your component, and there is this period of time where you have let's say you have a child component that receives values through inputs, right?
Yeah.
And those, if you've been working with Angular for a while, you know that the values for those inputs aren't guaranteed to be there until at least ng on init. So that means when that component is constructed, you can't trust or those values are not going to be there. So there's this period of time that component, it becomes part of the page. The DOM, like Angular tries to mount that component to the DOM, but you don't have any values in that input. So like you have to make sure that you're handling those cases. And one thing that I was really excited for that touches on this is that if you have input signal and you say input.required and Angular goes to instantiate that component, before you have a value. Let's say that value comes from a data service, and that data service is, there's a delay there, right?
Yeah.
Then the Angular framework is going to give you an error, like this is required, but there's no value provided. There are ways to get around that, but like you can provide a default value and handle that, or you can provide an alternate type, like this is going to be a string type or null, right?
Right.
and you can handle that there, but that still feels weird. You have, as an Angular developer, you have to think about this period of time between when that component is constructed, when the constructor runs, and when everything in that file is usable in
Right.
ng on init.
Yeah.
And I think that the inject function, I think, paves the way to us getting away from that. I think it opens up a lot of possibilities and it simplified a lot of things. So like we used to have this concept of guards, right? That
Yeah.
were classes you had to instantiate.
Yeah.
And same with interceptors. They used to be classes with decorators and the framework, like you had to implement an interface and then you had to build out a method on that class. And it was the same for interceptors and guards in that respect.
Right.
And so like you would use the constructor there and all that kind of thing. But did it really need to be all that ceremony? Now in modern Angular, both of those things are just functions. But we
Yeah.
still need a way to inject a data service for like maybe an async guard or maybe an async process in an interceptor or something like that. So uh, so the inject function allows us to do that, and it just simplifies a lot of things. So I think this is going to be one of those controversial things, and I get it. I think this is another step in the right direction.
I mean, to be fair, everything here that finally made it to the updated style guide went through the RFC process, and it was all these things here were presented to the community, and the community had the opportunity to share their thoughts around it. And the reason why it made it here was because it was ultimately everyone came around it, if not initially, and loved it and agreed that this is a much easier and the recommended pattern. It should be the recommended pattern to have all these things set up for us. So
To kind of bring together what I was saying real quick is I now I do think that the object-oriented program paradigm kind of makes sense with the classes to a certain degree, but at least in the backend world, when I was working in .NET, I very seldomly created classes and knew that I was going to mutate properties on that classes after it was created. I wrote constructors and even overloaded constructors
yeah.
to build that object at that time. I didn't build an object minimally and then populate the stuff later. So that the concept of that feels weird to me, and I don't feel like so the fact that that's how Angular works, it just kind of feels like the class paradigm doesn't work
Right.
for components because of the way components work and are mounted to the DOM and like because of that like the component tree and the way data flows uh down. I don't think that classes are the right paradigm for that.
Yeah.
And I'm not necessarily saying that uh functions are either. But because I kind of like a more I think a template based approach would be better
Hmm.
personally, but that's another controversial topic. But I think that's relevant when we're talking about inject because I think it opens up the possibilities there.
For sure. Yeah. It is great to see the direction where now modern Angular is headed and shedding some of the things that weren't making sense for it and adapting things that more align with what goes on under the hood and how components are built and injected and just presented and consumed in our application. So all of that truly makes sense to me. Well, it's kind of a small one, but I think a really important one. The next one that we want to highlight today is use protected on class members that are only used by a components template. And when you look at it, it's like, oh, why does that need to be really specified? But if you don't add protected in front of the class member that you're declaring, by default, it's public. And sometimes people forget that and don't add protected, even though they wanted or desire the class member to be protected and not public, because by not explicitly adding it, they unintentionally make it public. That makes it accessible from other components like child components or parent components that are referencing it. And that's something that people tend to not pay attention to or unintentionally miss out on. So it's nice to see the attention to detail in the style guide about the littlest things. Like this one right here, real quick, use read only on properties that are initialized by Angular. It's just nice to be more declarative in what you're defining. And it just highlights the intention of the class member and makes it more defined or structured. What do you think, Tyler?
Yeah, I agree with that. And also, I've worked in projects where like a parent uses uses viewChild to get a reference of a child component and then calls functions on the child component from the parent. And I'm not going to say you should never, ever, ever do that because there might be some use case, some edge case somewhere where that might be the only way to do something. But I do know that I have never had to do that.
I think it's not the recommended Angular way to do that. It might be
Yeah.
something that you have to reach for in order to
Yeah.
make something work, that you just don't see a way around it. But it's not the recommended pattern to do that every time.
Yeah. And I think that, if you find yourself doing that, almost 100% of the time, that child component can just emit an event and you can catch that in the parent.
Right.
Like you don't need to uh there's no reason to call a function on or a method on a child component from a parent. Well, protected can ensure that that doesn't happen.
Mm-hmm.
So, like, of course, anybody changing the code or implementing something can go change protected to public, or whatever, and then they can do it. But it just, like you said, it communicates the intent that hey, this should not be accessible outside of this
Right.
component. And I think that's a good call out.
For sure. Yeah. Again, like it's the littlest things that refine your code and make it more intentional and make it more easier to consume too. And yeah, it's a definite improvement when you start adopting the style guide patterns that have been highlighted by the Angular team.
Yeah, coding defensively means making it harder for people to do things they shouldn't do.
Yeah, you're making it foolproof for sure. So, all right, on to the next one. I think this one's personally my favorite, how easy Angular team has made this for us. And in order to add this to the style guide, they actually also, as part of version 20, updated it so that this was a real possibility that you no longer had to rely on the modules, ngClass and ngStyle. You just use the class and style to add whatever you want to. This class and style bindings to add whatever you want to add to the template. And the change that they made in V20 was that you could have string interpolation so that if there's a variable that needs to be added as part of the class name, you can do that. And then we're shifting away from modules anyway, so I think this is a big advantage and a much more redefined way of defining dynamic classes or styles that you would want to add to your component. I know I've been refactoring some of our code to adapt this, and I can just see the visually how it's more clear what the intention is. Like, okay, this class needs to be, dense class needs to be added when density, the value of density equals high. So versus you kind of have to parse this object in your brain while trying to understand what class gets added when. So
Yeah, I agree with that. I think in the example here where you have class dot, the class you want to apply, and then a Boolean value, that gets us closer to HTML spec, right? Like
right.
these look more like attributes. And in Angular, if you're used to kind of Angular's template syntax, then you know that if you want Angular to process a value for like a JavaScript or TypeScript value for that, then you just surround it with brackets, right?
Yeah.
So I think this gets us closer. It's not the same as an HTML spec, but it gets us closer to kind of that same paradigm rather than something that is Angular, almost like a domain specific language. It gets us
Right.
closer to that. And I think it's more consumable that way. It's definitely more readable. But I do want to call out that it's not shown in this example, but if you want to avoid using ngClass and pulling in those modules and stuff like that, and you can just use class and reference it the same way that you've always done with ngClass. So if you're watching this video and you can see that second example, they're using ngClass where they, in the value for the attribute, they open up an object and they specify the class name and then the Boolean
Right.
there, you can still use that same syntax in class without ngClass. So
Right.
you don't have to change. So like if you've got and we've had some use cases like this where we're conditionally applying several classes
Right.
to things, especially in like reusable components and stuff like that, to make those components versatile. This can become a little bit more manageable, maybe to some people. I could see where that might be more manageable to some than others because we're all a little bit different, right? And we have different preferences. But I wanted to call out that the way you've always done in ngClass is still possible with class.
Right. Yeah, I think like yeah, for personally, if there are like five or six or maybe 10 different classes that are mentioned that are derived from some value, when you look at the template, you have to go like, oh, so how is the class density getting applied? You have to scroll through that versus here. I don't know. Well, reading the code is just so much more easier to just like, oh, class.density. That's what I have to look for. And I just find the value, or yeah, in this class.dens, and I just have to find the value that makes it truthy value so that it gets applied. Yeah, it's simplifying the way that not only we write code, but internally also not having to rely on modules helps to keep your code bundle lightweight. And like it mentions over here too that the directives incur an additional performance cost compared to the inbuilt binding syntax. So it's definitely a smoother experience, a smoother developer experience. So you have to define it in this way too. All right. The last one that we wanted to highlight was to name event handlers for what they do, not for the triggering event. And this is, again, one of the things that can seem a little controversial, and it kind of ties to the philosophy. Naming is hard, no matter how experienced you are, or if you just started being a developer, naming is a hard problem to solve for. However, when you look at this and try to really understand what they're saying, it makes sense because you don't really want to specify how the event was triggered. You don't want to really specify how the function, when you look at your component, was what made you come to it, but you want to understand what action is being performed by that function. So when you're looking at your component, you don't want to say, oh, it has to handle click versus, oh, this function actually saves the user data. That makes more sense and it just clicks right away.
Yeah, I agree with that. There's two kind of ways to look at this from a readability perspective, and that's what this is about, is readability, right?
Yeah.
So when I'm looking through a template, all right, let's say that we have a bug on saving data, and I am the developer that has been assigned to that, and I'm trying to find where that's happening. Where do I start with that? I start with, okay, where in the web app is this happening? What page is this on? I look at that page. What component is this? So the first thing that I go to is I'm going to go to the template of that component, and I'm going to find that form, and I'm going to look for this button or the form or whatever on submit, whatever, wherever that action may be triggered. And I'm going to see, okay, what action is triggering that, or what action is triggered when I save this form. And if I just see handle click, I'm like, oh, okay. Um, yeah, a lot of editors will, you can control click on that and it'll take you to it most of the time. But, I've seen that be kind of buggy in a variety of editors I've used over the years.
Right.
As a matter of fact, it's buggy in VS Code right now. So sometimes that works, sometimes it doesn't.
Yeah.
So a lot of times what you end up doing is, um, but you start there. And if I go down to this thing and I say, okay, save data, okay, I'm like, all right. Or sometimes if it's a big template, um, I might hit that control F and be like, okay, save. I'll type in save because I'm assuming surely somebody is going to name this, save user data, right?
Right.
Or save something. Save is going to be in the name, most likely.
Yeah.
If not, then at least save will probably show me the button with the button text, save or something like that, or maybe there's a class name. Anyway, the keyword save should take me somewhere close to where I need to be to figure out what function is firing. And if the function clearly states what's happening when that event is fired, then it just kind of helps readability, helps you find what you're looking for.
Yeah.
Versus handle click. So there is another way to that where you're in a component and you're like maybe doing a little bit of refactoring and you're trying to figure out, okay, where is this function used? If it's just save user data, you really don't know that it's used on an event.
Yeah.
Maybe it is, maybe it isn't. But I mean, if it's a component and it's a function and it's not referenced in that component that class anywhere else, then chances are it's used in the template. I mean, that's not hard to figure out. So I think that I think that this naming helps you find what you need to find and doesn't really cost anything, no matter which way you look at it. So I've often wished that functions were named this way. but I've never seen a function named this way and wished it was different.
Yeah, I agree with all things. And just generally, when you're looking at the component, you kind of want to see what all it's handling versus like handle click or handle event handlers more than what all it's actually taking care of. I mean, the other thing is save user data might be applied to multiple buttons, not just one, or multiple actions. It might just not be triggered by a click or handle click. It might not be triggered by a button, but it might be triggered by some other user action. So do you want to like name it differently based on what user action is deriving what the event is the function is actually doing? Probably not. You want to be able to save user data based, no matter if it's clicking the escape button or some other interaction or hovering over something or not just handling the click of a button. And similarly, Angular does, I mean, in the style guide, they do recommend that sometimes it might not make sense. It might be impractical to declare just one well-named handler. For example, if based on the key that was hit, if you want to handle different scenarios based on the key that was handled, you want to do handle key down because that's the trigger point of what the different functions that might be wrapped in it. So sometimes it makes sense, but more often than not, it makes sense to name the event function to align with what it's doing and not what the or how the event is being triggered. Overall, I think all the 5 style guide suggestions, because these are that, like they're suggestions that the Angular team wants you to adopt in your architectural pattern or your coding style for when you're crafting Angular applications. I think they're great. I think they work really well for most of the Angular projects that you see out there. I don't see any one of those that can be an anomaly to what you usually see. So I think this was a well needed and well thought out style guide that the team has come up with. I'm all for it. And I've been adopting all these patterns that have been recommended in these and actually have posted a lot of these over to our own component architectural design docs. So I think these are great. Do you have any final thoughts, Tyler, about this or anything else that you're vibing about recently?
Yeah, I have some thoughts. I think these are good changes. I think again, when we start thinking about the changes coming to Angular, I want people to challenge the conventional beliefs of Angular, and I don't want I'm really really tired of seeing the Angular is just becoming React. No, it's not. Its routing is different. Its reconciliation algorithm, aka change detection, is different. Its component structure is different. The way data flows is different. Its signal implementation is different. Everything about Angular is different. It is not becoming React because interceptors or whatever became a function instead of a class. I'm tired of seeing that.
Yeah.
Instead I want to challenge people to challenge the way they think about Angular conventionally and think, does this part of Angular really need to be different from other frameworks? There are parts of Angular that I think Angular needs to keep that make it uniquely awesome. And I think that's things like dependency injection, the way we can configure providers where we need them without having to think about or change our architecture, I think is a big benefit in Angular. The Angular router is genius. The amount that you can do with the Angular router with its kind of declarative based pattern, I think is amazing.
Yeah.
But like maybe on all these other things, maybe it makes sense to kind of get closer to what other frameworks are doing, just so that Angular becomes easier to use while still keeping its identity in the ways that it needs to be and is truly unique. And as always, there are people behind these changes. There are people behind these frameworks. And if you don't like something, it's great to provide feedback. The Angular team wants to hear it. But remember, they are people. And your savage response isn't helping anyone or anything. So give constructive feedback, give constructive criticism. Please do, because it makes the entire community better. But be respectful to the people who put in a lot of time and effort to make these things when you do it. Just be considerate.
Absolutely. I think it's so easy in this day and age to get carried away with your emotions and vented using your keyboard when but Angular is an open source framework. Feel free to send PRs that you think strongly feel about or actively participate in the RFCs that Angular team so actively posts or shares. Like any change that the Angular team wants to bring to the framework, they have an RFC for it. And any change that they want to introduce, they go through the 3 cycles of being an experimental, developer preview, and then finally stable. So even while you're experimenting with it and not really feeling it, you can share feedback. It's not set in stone until it's stable. And then it still might go through improvements. Like stable doesn't mean that it's written in stone and it's never going to get updated anywhere. So there are a lot of things to consider, that an Angular is like truly unique. It's not going anywhere and it's never going to change based on what other frameworks are doing. But yes, it is going to change based on what web APIs are capable of, what modern browsers are capable of. And for example, they deprecated animations module because now you can do all of those animations in native CSS. So yes, it will change, it will evolve with the times, and it will adapt reactive patterns and all the new things that are just evolving in the web sphere, but it still is unique in its own way, and that's no one's gonna take that away from Angular. So, and I think the style guide is a great starting point for anyone who is either trying to familiarize with how to build Angular apps or is still aware of it and has been doing for years, but is never really sure if they're doing it the right way. Well, one of the things that make Angular unique is it has an Angular way for doing most of the things that come inbuilt with the framework, and you don't have to rely on third-party or external libraries. Do you have routing solutions and all those things? So that's the thing I think most Angular developers like us love about Angular, and it's just so easy to get started on an app and have it to be really performant without having to think twice about it. All you gotta do is stay on the latest version and keep updating. And if there's something blocking you from updating, that's what you need to look at, not the Angular framework. That's what you want to strip away or reconsider having to be part of your application.
I agree.
Yeah. So, well, thank you everyone who's been a part of this, and we will hope to catch you next time with something new about web or Angular. Who knows? But stay tuned. Thanks.